Welcome. So in this session we're going to look through a simple HTML document and add a style sheet to it. So the first thing we see on the left is the HTML of our document, and on the right we see the document output. So let's go through the content. The first nested group of elements that we have is a header, and this corresponds to this portion of the screen. So we've got a header and we've got a class of example that we will take off for now. And let's take the class of example off this article as well. Our header has got two elements nested immediately within it. There's an H1 and there's a nav. The nav has got an unordered list within that, and the unordered list has four elements nested within it. Then we've got our second part of the content, which is the main. Our main element has got two articles within it. The first article begins here and ends all the way down here. So here's our first article, and our second article is somewhat shorter. So here's the second article when it's rendered, and here's the first article when it's rendered. Within the article, a second level heading, two paragraphs, and then a subsection. And then this subsection also has an unordered list within it. And then right at the bottom of the document we see the end is a little footer section. So the document itself has got three top layer parts. There's a header, and then there's the main section and the footer. You'll notice that you can really understand the structure of the document because of the way the elements are nested and indented within it. This is a really important part of designing a good document so that somebody else can maintain it, not just yourself, or fair enough yourself after several months if you've gone away from it. If you don't have any indenting, it's really difficult to understand the structure of a page when you're just looking at it. So do make sure that with your source code you always indent. So the next thing we're going to do is start an empty style sheet. So let's bring that up, and I'll put the style sheet side by side with the source code so that you can see both. And I'll rearrange these windows. So now we have three columns: source code, CSS, and output. So the first thing I have to do is establish a link between my HTML and my style sheet. So I can do this by adding a link element, like so. So here we have a link. The relationship between this document and the thing that I'm pointing to is that it's a style sheet, and we have a URL for the document. Now you can notice that I haven't used quotation marks here. In HTML5, quotation marks are optional, providing that the URL that you're connecting to or the attribute that you're typing details of doesn't have any spaces in it. It's considered quite good practice to put quotation marks in anyway, so I'm going to do that here, because it just helps to cue the reader to know that this is an attribute. So there we go. The style sheet is now linked, but we have no styles in it, so we haven't seen any change in the output. So let's add a body element, or a body selector with a rule, and let's change the font to be sans serif. There we go. So to help us understand the different parts of the document, let's do a CSS selector that's got the header, the main, and the footer. So you'll see that here's the header and the main that goes all the way down to the bottom, and then our little footer at the end. And let's set a border that is thin, green, and dashed around each of those. So there we can now see here's our different sections. So we can start to think about styling these. Now I want my content to be centered on the page and I don't want it to be too wide, because text that goes too wide is difficult to read. Because if we start reading here on this and then right all the way to we could, it's a long way to jump our heads back to have. So let's make it a bit narrower, maybe about 30 characters wide at the maximum. So let's say max width for each of these elements will be 30 ems. There we go, and we can see it. The content has now come down to a manageable size. And I want this content to be centered in the middle of the screen. So the way we achieve that is just to say that it'll have a margin that is automatic. And the margin appears either side of the elements. Once we save this, our content now appears in the middle of the screen. So we're starting to get it nicely formatted. Let's add a little color onto each of these panels as well. Ground color, and we'll use the red, green, blue color model. So how much red light do we want? I can have 0 red, 0 green, and 100% blue. So FF is hexadecimal for 255, which is the maximum that we can have. So if we were to make the background 0000FF, we would get a bright blue background. And I'm going to want to add some red light and some green light. So if I were to add 7F to about halfway, it'll get lighter. And let's go all the way to something like CF. So that's becoming a very light heading. Let's go even lighter. Great, now between each of the sections I would like to have a little bit of space. So I'm going to add a little margin above and below each. So now the margin is set at the top and the bottom of each of these elements, and it's still automatic on the left and the right. I also want to have some space inside the elements as well. Padding 1em. Let's see how that looks. Great. Although that's somewhat strange, because what we've just seen there is that when we add the padding, the element grows. This goes all the way back to the very, very early decisions that were taken around CSS and the box model, which is the model that includes the content, the padding around the content, the border around the padding around the content, and the margin around the border. And the way that the width and height of elements were calculated initially was done differently in different browsers, and there was no agreement on how this box model should work. So one of the things that we can do right at the top of the document is say box sizing model is going to be called border box. And once we set that, you'll notice that the size jumped back down. So now if we add and remove the padding, the width of the element does not change. The height changes because once the padding has been added to the inside, the content must now reflow and go further down. So this setting of box sizing border box is a very important reset that you will probably want to have in every single style sheet that you create. Another thing that can be quite useful, and I'm just going to comment everything out for a second so that we go back to a completely simple style sheet. So I've done a comment now that means that none of this style sheet is getting used. So if none of this style sheet is getting used, why is the heading still bold? Why are list items indented? And why is there a space above and below a paragraph? Well, that happens because of what's called a user agent style. Your browser is a user agent. It is an agent that is acting upon your behalf. You are the user. And it goes and requests content and it displays it to you. So your user agent has got a default style. And we can even remove that. So if we were to move this comment down to here now so that we have got our catch-all selector, we can, for example, set font size to be 100% on absolutely every element. And so now all of the headings lose their different sizes. We can set font weight to be normal on every element. And now nothing is bold anymore. We can set the margin above and below every element to be 0. And now everything squidges up together because there isn't any space added around it. And the only thing else we need to reset if we really want to remove everything is remove all the padding. And it's padding that helps list items be indented from the side of the page. So once we save this, you'll see that we've now gone to a very, very simple version of this document. And if we turn all of our other styles back on at this point, you'll see that the styling that's now in the page is only the fact that we've changed the font to be sans serif and that we've given ourselves a border, we've set the width, we've set the margins, we've set the backgrounds, we've set the padding, but nothing else is styled. So by default, when you use CSS, you are combining the browser's default style sheet, the user agent style sheet, with your own. It's quite common, therefore, to see something like this at the top of a CSS file, because that removes all of the default styles, so anything that is on screen that is styling is something that you have created, and that way you've got complete control over the page. So let's continue on with that, and let's add some different sizes for the headings. We'll make H1 be 240%. We'll make H2 be 150%. And we'll make H3 be 125%. There we go. H1, H2 and H3. And we can also add some padding on top of these as well, or a little bit of margin before them. So let's do that for all headings that we're going to use. So if we add padding to each of the headings, and let's make it 3 ems wide so that it's really obvious what's happening. We've added padding to each of these headings, and now they're all indented, but notice that the padding to the left of H1 is larger than the padding to the left of H2, and that in turn is larger than the padding to the left of H3. That's because the M is relative to the current size. So because H1 is 240%, it is 90% bigger, so the padding here is 90% bigger than down here as well. That's not necessarily what we want. What we would like to have is a kind of stable padding based on the root element size. So fortunately, CSS gives us the concept of a root element or a rem, and from that gives us now padding of 3 rems, 3 root elements, which is the same no matter what size the text is, and it's all relative to the base font size. So that's very useful for us. So let's set a color on all of the headings. So H1, H2 and H3. I'm going to set a color, and let's make it some kind of a red. So let's give it a lot of red, maybe a little bit of green, and not very much blue at all. There we go. So I've been able to set a color on all 3 headings using a single selector. That's the comma separator. Very useful indeed. It's apparent now that I've got colour in those headings that we do need to sort out the margins between paragraphs and headings and paragraphs. So let's add a margin to the top of each heading, and let's make that 1 rem in size. There we go. So each of our headings now has a healthy margin at the top of it. We probably want to have a little margin around all paragraphs as well. So let's say margin of the top of all paragraphs will be maybe just half a rem. There we go. So now every paragraph has got a nice small margin just at the top of it. So the next thing I need to fix is these unordered lists. So list item, and I'm going to set the margin to the left of the bullet points. Margin left. Oh, let's make it 2 ems. Now, in all of these examples so far, where I've been setting margin, I've been saying margin dash top or margin dash left. There's also a shorthand way that you can set margins top right, bottom and left all at the same time. So if we just take off margin, then the margins all around the element are set automatically. But we are also able to say, and it always goes clockwise in this direction, the top will have no margin, the right will have 2 M's, the bottom will have no margin, and the left will have none. So at the moment we'll end up with our list item appearing to be back where it was before. So top, right, bottom, left, and what we want to do is move it from there to there. So now we're saying no margin on the top, no margin to the right, no margin to the bottom, and 2 M's on the left, and there we go. So this clockwise notation is something that we often see. So we now have quite a nicely formatted page. The thing that's missing is any navigation. So let's have a look at that nav section and let's start to think about styling that. And we'll begin by making our lives easier by highlighting it. So let's say nav background yellow. So there is our nav section. And we want to format the items within it as if there's some kind of menu having menu buttons in there. So let's say that all list items that are somewhere descended from a nav will have a background that is red. So now our list items have got red backgrounds. We can see them quite easily. Let's not do it with a word. Let's do 77 red, no green and no blue. So it'll be quite a dark, somewhere lighter than that. A dark red, and then we'll set a foreground color of white. Okay. Now we don't really need those bullet points if these are going to be menu items. So we can say text, not text decoration, it's list style type, and we can set it to be disk and all sorts of things, but what we're going to set it to is none. So now those bullet points disappear. That's good. And we don't need our margin either for these things, do we? So every list item that is a child of a nav will have no margin all the way around. Now because this selector comes after this selector, you might think that that's why this is overriding it. If we were to move this all the way up here though, so that it happens first, so that here our list item has got its margin set to 0, but then here the list item margin is reset, you might think it would change the output, but it doesn't. I've just saved this and there's no change. And the reason for this is part of the strength of CSS. This is the cascade. And when the cascade is analysed, when the different rules that can affect an element are looked at, the important thing here is that this selector has got more detail in it than this one. This selector is more specific. The more specific the selector, the later it happens in the cascade, and therefore anything previous gets overwritten. So although nav li is above li in our style sheet, in terms of specificity, this one gets applied last, so it overwrites any backgrounds, colours, list style types or margins that have previously been set. So it moved everything back to where it was. So our navigation section is now no longer visible, and so we can remove the bit that makes it yellow. What we do have though is an unordered list, which is currently showing the list items as a vertical list. Now I'd like to make this a horizontal menu, so to do that I'll use a selector that takes unordered lists that are within the navigation section, and I do this because I don't want this unordered list down the bottom to be affected, just this one up the top. So unordered lists that are within navigation, I'm going to set the display property to be flex, and magically as soon as I save this it goes into a horizontal list because the default flex direction is row. So when I say that, nothing changes. Now there are several alternatives. I can say it's a row reverse, and when I save that you'll see that the row now goes back to front and it's item 4, 3, 2, 1 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. In addition to row, I could go back to column and the content looks as before, and of course there is a column reverse that merely reverses the order of things, but I want a row. Now I'd like to have some space in between these items, so let's say I have to justify my content and I'm going to do space between, and so magically these are now aligned with the start and the end of the container, and then the space that's in between is equally spaced out amongst the items. Now my list items, I don't have any padding in them at the moment, and that means that the text is right up to the edge, so let's add a bit of padding. There we go, these are starting to look a bit like buttons now, and to make them really look a bit more buttony we'll probably want to add a border radius of 0.25 of the size of one letter. There we go, so now they're starting to look like buttons. So we've built a full page from scratch using CSS. We can go further and animate the buttons and all of the navigation for the page, so we'll do that in a future video.